Welcome back to Sociology 227. This is Judith Butler, video 1. In this video, I've got 3 goals. In the first, I'm going to introduce you to the life and work of Judith Butler. Next, I'm going to review how we talked about desire in SOCY 226 and earlier in SOCY 227. Finally, I'm going to review the work of Michel Foucault. This will get you ready to do the readings. The readings are going to be tough this week, guys, but I know you can do it. Let's get started. Judith Butler is Maxine Elliott Professor of Comparative Literature and Critical Theory at the University of California, Berkeley. I should make clear that she is not a sociologist, nor is she interested in a general theory of social organization. She is required reading in gender theory, however, and thus why we are talking about her work today. Note that when I write critical theory, just think about all the non-sociologists we're reading in 227. Chances are, if they are reading Foucault and Marx, they belong in that camp. Butler is author of Gender Trouble, Bodies That Matter, and most recently, The Force of Nonviolence. Butler is interested in both a theory of gender performance and in political agency stemming from, but not restricted to, that theory. Hence why I've included The Force of Nonviolence. So even if you aren't interested in gender and its relation to sex, how we act politically in the field of power is pertinent to any and all aspects of sociology, in my reading. In my own field of disability studies, for example, one must read her as well. What matters for us is how Judith Butler uses Foucault and Freud to reframe feminist thought around the problem of gender. Butler wants to establish a feminist project that doesn't take an essential, forever, and eternal understanding of what a woman or man is as its object. This means questioning the immutability of sex and questioning the forms of desire that feminist theory projects onto women and men, primarily as heterosexual. In this way, Judith Butler presents us a queer theory of feminist performance. Part of Judith Butler's project in Gender Trouble is thinking about how psychoanalysis treats gender. Here she wants to think about the ways that Freud established gender norms in his psychoanalytic thought, and also think about the ways that feminist psychoanalysts have tried to reframe that problem. I'll start with Freud and desire. Remember, Freud argues that both personal and social development are the outcome of processes through which desire is satisfied. Freud believed that all mental action is part of a process of satisfying wants or needs. Personality development is based, ultimately, on the desires established in the earliest states of human life. In this way, psychoanalysis is based on the role that desires play in the formation of the psyche and the development of the bodily subject. Freud suggests that we have psychic desires that manifest subconsciously, that is, inaccessible to our conscious thought. When these desires conflict, we experience symptoms, as in the case of neurosis. The family structure is the basis for so many of the pathological mental states we have later in life. We can also see these desires manifest in our dreams. Freud suggests we can uncover these same desiring relationships in dreams. Starting with simplistic children's dreams, Freud suggests dream symbolism fulfills our unconscious drives. As a whole, psychoanalysis is an exploration of how biology, psychology, and society interact in desire in conscious, subconscious, and preconscious ways. What matters to us is not the ways that we come to desire the ways we do, but that psychoanalysis explores the fact that we are always desiring something, and this manifests in the ways in which we engage ourselves, others, and society as a whole, often in non-rational ways. When we talk about libidinal drives, we are talking about the ways that sexual desire expresses and reflects our psychic development. It's not important to understand every aspect of Freud. What matters is you understand this. Part of personality development is sexual development. In coming up with the theory of sexual development, Freud suggests there are paths we all take in developing a personality. Butler is going to argue that these take assumptions about gender and sex and exclude those individuals who don't fit those rigid norms. Again, she's trying to reframe psychoanalysis through a feminist and queer lens. Let's turn to Parsons to see these same trends at work, albeit in a much more conservative manner. Recall that Parsons was reading Freud too, alongside Durkheim and Max Weber. In the book you see here, Parsons will argue that there is a compatibility between Freud's focus on personality development and desire with his focus on mediating action systems, combining Weber's theory of action with Durkheim's structural sociology. In SOCY 226, I gave the example of the school class as a social system. Parsons tells us that the school class, as it progresses from primary to tertiary school, acts as both a sorting space and a place of moral education in the Durkheimian tradition. So he wants to look at how social action and personality development are structured through the school class. We begin with a single teacher school class, usually headed by a woman in Parsons and Freud's time, who governs education. Numerous class activities are gender segregated, as are friendships, and the teacher is the first generalizable social role that the students encounter. A teacher, and not my mother. Then, as we progress through high school, the differentiation of instruction increases. You have numerous teachers for numerous subjects, and students start dating those of the opposite sex. Opposite sex in scare quotes. Finally, at the university level, we see the moral component of education drop off, whereas technical skills take over as the main purpose of the structure. My point here is not to reproduce my Parsons lecture, but to suggest to you, dear students, that he wants to put Freud and Weber and Durkheim together in the analysis of education systems. Part of this story is about the structures of desire that govern collective action. Now, Butler talks about Freud, but does not, so far as I know, occupy herself with Parsons. I include him here to say we're in the same ballpark. Parsons is pretty conservative, whereas Butler is a radical theorist. Accordingly, let's look to the critical theories of Marx and Fanon. Psychoanalysis looks at personality development and sexual development. Both express wants and needs. We could call this an internal economy of desire. In this sense, just as Canada has an internal economy, we have an internal economy of desire. We've already talked about the expression of desire in the economy. The economy distributes needs and wants. When we read Marx last semester, we talked about commodity fetishism. This term should make you think of Freud and psychoanalysis. To fetishize something is to attribute godlike properties to it. Marx says we do this with commodities when we indicate they have a value. Nothing has a value in the economy. It is something attributed in the process of the exchange, says Marx. Gold isn't worth anything, any more than the $5 bill in your pocket. Marx says that we fetishize the commodity, as in, give the gold a value, under capitalism. This is also about the allocation of wants and desires. So we've already talked about the sociology of desire in this class when we talk about economic power and distribution in the eyes of Karl Marx. When I write the political economy of desire, I mean to indicate the ways that we express ourselves in our desires, the ways that desires are socially structured, and the ways that power and authority are involved in this process. This is the space where people like Judith Butler incorporate psychoanalysis into feminist theory. Let's move from Marx to Fanon on colonial repression. In my first post-colonialism lecture, I spoke to you about Frantz Fanon as an anti-colonial thinker. Recall, Fanon, the revolutionary psychoanalyst, argues that to grow up in a colonial society is to undergo psychic trauma. Freud argues that psychic trauma from childhood is the most likely cause of pathological personality development later in life. If we root out this trauma, we can resolve the conflict and the symptoms will disappear. Fanon argues that if the cause is colonial occupation, then the solution is rooting out the cause of symptoms. This is not a call for psychoanalysis, then, but for revolution. I bring up Fanon and Marx to give you an understanding of the critical and cultural extension of psychoanalytic theory. When we are doing cultural psychoanalysis, we are looking past the institution of the family. We are looking to the systems of race and economic organization, how they inform and repress our expressions of desire. This is the twofold way that Butler looks to psychoanalysis, as a space of desire and exclusion. While Butler looks to psychoanalysis, she also relies heavily on Michel Foucault. She reads Foucault as a philosopher of norms. Foucault is interested in truth, how we tell truths about ourselves, how we tell truths about particular objects, etc. We have discourses about mental illness that shape the objects that we call mental illness and the way people identify with them. We have discourses about sexual practices and various ways that people should be governed to avoid STIs, pregnancies, to have pregnancies, etc. In both of these cases, the object and ways of being a person are shaped discursively. Remember, discourse produces truth. Butler reads Foucault as a philosopher and historian of norms. It isn't the particular norm that is the object of scrutiny, but the ways in which we incorporate historically situated norms into our lives. Butler wants to ask how gendered norms come into existence, where and how they come into existence, and how this relates to the category of sex and sexual desire. So what's important for us is this. Gender is a form of institutionally organized subjectivity. It is also a form of identity that we establish. So too is sex, says Butler, a form of institutionally organized subjectivity. In the case of both sex and gender, power enters the picture, determining who has which sex, who is able to claim a particular sex and gender, and according sex and gender normatively to various institutional inhabitants. They are discursive outcomes. We perform them, yes, but they are also pushed on us. This is really important. Butler is going to argue that the truths of sex and gender are historically constituted, just like the objects of sexuality that Foucault is speaking about. When we tell the truth about gender, and when we tell the truth about sex, when we divide gender from sex, we are doing the work of discourse, producing truth. I want to end this video focusing on one of the key differences between Michel Foucault and Judith Butler, the question of psychoanalysis. Butler and Foucault will differ significantly on the place that psychoanalysis plays in all this. Butler is a proponent of using psychoanalysis to explore the ways that we express desire. Foucault argues the complete opposite. In The History of Sexuality, he calls this the repressive hypothesis, namely the suggestion that the Victorian era was one where sexuality was very repressed, and this repression caused people to act their desires out otherwise. Foucault says that we did talk about sex in the Victorian period, and we did so all the time, just in particular institutions. Psychiatry was part of the deployment of sexuality. Freud theorized, for example, the Oedipus complex, whereby the parent of the same sex is treated as an enemy and the parent of the opposite sex is an object of attraction, which works itself out in other ways, the basis of neurosis. Mama's boy, daddy issues, you know. Both of these are lay versions of the structures of the Oedipus complex. What is the Oedipus complex for Foucault? Is it an essential part of our personality development? No, it is a bourgeois trick, whereby the Victorian middle-class family comes to be taken as the norm for all people. Psychoanalysis is just another form of psychiatry that has deployed a morally loaded version of personhood onto people. It tells us about the structures of Victorian society, not the structures of our personal desires. For Foucault, sexuality is deployed like soldiers to battle. Psychiatry is war by other means. Butler is going to argue that Foucault's position is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Foucault went too far when he condemned the entirety of psychoanalysis for thrusting bourgeois morality on all of us. We can and must reclaim the science of desire for feminist purposes, the main task of which is explaining how gender is performative. Okay, now it's your turn to do the readings. This is going to be hard. I'm not going to lie to you, but you guys can do it. I know you can. See you in the next video.